Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Julia Bryan, and I'm the Vice Chair of the CERGE-EI Foundation. I'll be the moderator today, joined by Eva Hromádková, who's also a CERGE-EI alumna and instructor in our distance learning program, and our very special guest, Martin Tolar. Our call today is part of the Distance Learning Program Speaker Series run by the CERGE-EI Foundation. Our webinar is going to be recorded, so if you're interested in listening to it again after the call, no worries, and we'd love for you to share it as well. Before we get started, note that we've gathered together a few questions already, and we also encourage you to add your questions to the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. We're delighted to have 18 countries represented with attendees from 15 universities, a number of public institutions, nonprofits, and think tanks. Please also introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from and what you're studying. I have the privilege of introducing you to Dr. Martin Tolar today. He's a leader in the field of Alzheimer's disease research and drug development. Dr. Tolar is the founder, president, and CEO of Alzheon. Founded in 2013, Alzheon is now in the final stages of clinical testing for a groundbreaking treatment for Alzheimer's disease, which we'll hear about later. Prior to founding Alzheon, Dr. Tolar held executive positions in several prominent life sciences companies. In his roles at Gnome, Normoxis, and Comentis, he successfully established and grew new organizations, business areas, and product opportunities. For his time in the corporate world, Dr. Tolar had a successful academic career in the Department of Neurology at Yale University School of Medicine. He holds an MD from Charles University and played a pivotal role in the student strikes that led to the Velvet Revolution in 1989. In 2021, Dr. Tolar founded the International Neurodegenerative Disorders Research Center, INDRC, a global institute that leverages artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify and validate therapeutic interventions for Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative disorders. He currently serves as chair of the INDRC Executive Board. Dr. Tolar's dedication extends beyond his research. He serves on multiple business and scientific boards, including the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, the Alzheimer Foundation, the Advanced Healthcare Management Institute, and the CERGE-EI Foundation. His remarkable contributions have earned him recognition as one of the top 100 most influential people in drug development and manufacture by the Medicine Maker magazine's Power List for multiple years. And in 2021, he was honored with the Czech Laurels Award from the Czech Chamber of Commerce for his leadership in Alzheimer's disease, therapeutics, and his contributions to clinical, scientific, and business projects in the Czech Republic. Join us today as we learn from the insights and experiences of a true pioneer in the field of Alzheimer's research and innovation, Dr. Martin Tolar. So, Martin, we are really interested in hearing more about your journey toward the cure for Alzheimer's and your experience with the pharma industry. If you could just jump into your presentation, we're ready to go.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk to you about our work at Alzheon. If I can have the first slide, please. So maybe, again, you heard a little bit of a background. I still don't see the slide.
There we go.
Okay. So I know you're primarily interested in the economics of our work and so forth, but I'll walk you a little bit sort of how we get to where we are, and then we can talk, how we deal. As one of the questions was, how we compete with the giants, how you build a biotech company, how you actually enter this kind of business and so forth. So first of all, this is one of about a dozen companies I started. Where I was very fortunate, the way you build this kind of company is to collect the smartest people you ever encounter, and hopefully they will join you in this kind of quest. And I've been very fortunate to really pick these folks, from the different universities I attended, but also the companies I worked at and the companies I started. And really, if I go to the next slide, the task at this company has been really, can we understand the science of Alzheimer's disease? So for those who haven't heard much about Alzheimer's, so it's the major cause of dementia. It affects, in its terminal stage, about 30-40 million people on the planet. It's the 6th leading cause of death. and the costs run in trillions of dollars. But again, the biggest challenge for finding a treatment was understanding the science. So really at the beginning of our journey, which is about over a decade ago, I assembled really the smartest scientists, and we started to try to understand the biology, which only enabled us to really develop a treatment. Next slide. And really, what is very clear, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, is that for really changing the course of the disease, you have to affect the underlying biology, but also you have to do it with an approach that is safe and oral treatment, which is really where we come in as a company that's developing this kind of oral approach. Our approach to solving the scientific puzzle has been to focus on the highest risk patients. And in Alzheimer's disease, the number one risk is age, and I'll explain a little bit more later why is that the case. And the second most important risk is a gene called 8-lipoprotein E4, which prevents really clearance of the toxin from the brain that's causing Alzheimer's disease. This gene is present in about 20% of people, so every 50 person on the planet. But the patients with this gene represent 2/3 of patients with Alzheimer's. And our approach has been to first focus on these patients and try to figure out the biology and the pathology, and then also the treatment for them, and then go to the rest of the population. And that's where we were successful. So what people don't understand, and this is now just a little entry into the biology of the brain and why the brain and neurodegenerative disorders start, is that the brain is the most metabolically active organ in the body. We burn about 20% of energy of our body in the brain, even though it represents only 2% of our body. And we generate about a weight of the brain, which is about 3 pounds of byproducts of the toxins every year. And if we are young and our vessels are young, we can clear these toxins fairly effectively. So the first 40, 50 years, most people are able to do that. But once we get older and the vessels are not able to do it as effectively, there's accumulation of these toxins in the brain. In Alzheimer's, it's a very specific toxin, and then it's causing, it affects, destroy the neurons, their connections, and really for the next 20, 30 years, the damage is accumulating. So that's kind of the 3 waves, light or blue waves there. And when the brain cannot cope with this damage, you have a clinical disease, which is the terminal disease. So really the goal for us is to be able to find the patients with the brain damage, very early in their 40s or 50s, and really prevent ever getting to the point of having the damage that shows as clinical symptoms. So the clinical symptoms again start showing only when the brain cannot deal with the damage. There's no regeneration in the brain, but there's what's called plasticity, that some parts of the brain can take over the affected parts. And the program, development programs has to work kind of at the early stages of the clinical disease, the terminal stage, because there are tools that actually allow us to show the efficacy of the treatments. So if you look at the patients that truly do have Alzheimer's disease, there are over 400 million people on the planet that have biologically defined Alzheimer's disease, and the advancements that Alzheon has made were in the 4 areas. Number 1, what is the toxin? We'll talk about a little bit later. And number 2, how you find patients with truly Alzheimer's disease, because there are other ways you can have a cognitive impairment. Number 3, how you use the biomarkers to find and follow these patients and follow the efficacy. And number 4, how you deal with the genetics. So where are we on the treatment landscape? So here we're getting a little bit into the economics. So this is the pipeline in Alzheimer's disease, the late stage pipeline. And it's really one thing that's striking is how little is really happening in Alzheimer's. And the reason for that is that for the past decade, the investments in Alzheimer's therapeutics has been estimated at $600 billion, which none of it led to a treatment, right? So the big pharma companies, and obviously the smaller companies as well, have lost so much money that they basically left the effort and said we just cannot afford losing tens of billions of dollars with no product. So that's the reason why the pipeline is so sparse. And there are two classes, and I'll talk about a bit later, of the treatments. One is what's called the antibodies, which is large molecules that are trying to bind the toxins. And then there's our approach that these antibodies have to be infused. They have all sorts of side effects we'll talk about later. And then we have very differentiated approach with a small molecule that can be used as a tablet, and again, used safely in the early stages and pre-symptomatically. Very importantly, every single other approach, and there have been numerous ways to target other potential pathways that have been postulated in Alzheimer's, have been negative. So this is the only approach that showed really effects in changing the course of the disease. This is the pathogenic cascade. Basically, what's happening in the brain, there's a protein that has a very important normal role, that if it gets trapped, it has a tendency to change its shape, clump, from these toxic clumps that destroy neurons, and then the brain protects itself with what's called forming the insoluble aggregates called plaque. Our advantage is that we intervene very early in that cascade. I'm not going to go much into science. And then the antibodies bind with different levels of selectivity these toxins, and that's what drives their efficacy. So this is what we call the product profiles. The top three lines talk about the efficacy, both on cognitive and functional scales. And you can see the antibodies have about 20 to 30% efficacy. That means they decrease the progression of the disease about 20-30%. Our treatment has shown improvement in these patients on the cognitive scales and stabilization on the functional, so dramatically better effect, even in this terminal stage. Very importantly, the antibodies have a number of side effects. Importantly, it's the brain edema hemorrhage, which is on the last row here, ranging, again, from 13 to 35% in overall population, but in those higher risk patients that we are studying, it goes from 30 to over 60%. Importantly, we have zero of these side effects. So we spent literally a decade, solving the scientific puzzle. We had a lot of support from the leading experts in the field. We have over 200 people that we work with, including, again, the All-Star Scientific Advisory Board. And we got support from National Institute on Aging, which supports our phase 3 study, which is the last study in the development, to the tune of now over $50 million. So we're getting close to the approval of the treatment. And I'm not going to go through the different specifics, but we have shown substantial efficacy that I showed you earlier, not only on the clinical measures, but also on the biomarkers, and importantly on preserving the brain volume. So the brain shrinks. The Alzheimer's brain is people ever saw, this is the normal brain. The Alzheimer's brain is dramatically shrunken, and ability to preserve the volume, prevent the shrinking, is one of the best evidence for changing the course of the disease. We have a drug that has been in almost 3,000 patients and has shown favorable safety profile even in long-term studies, lasting up to 2.5 years. We got a fast track designation from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. This is the regulatory body in the U.S., and that means that they value this approach and consider it very highly, very high probability and important. So they will work with us to get this to the patients quickly. And then, our advantage, in addition to the efficacy and safety, as I mentioned, is the fact that it's oral pill that can be taken twice daily, and really compared to the antibodies that needs very important infrastructure to be infused, and the safety monitoring, we avoid those costs. This is the phase 3 study that we're completing. Again, we will see the data in less than a year now. It's a very standard design. I'm not going to go through in much detail. So importantly, the data we do have is show us that we really take the toxin and flush it into the periphery. We have data from a number of our studies that show the increase of this toxin in the periphery and decrease in the brain. So that's the kind of the best evidence for the work that we have. And this is the summary of the effects in the study we just reported recently after 2-year treatment with the drug. again, we were able to stabilize the progression at a stage where these patients very dramatically decline. They literally go at this stage of the disease from little forgetful to not recognize that their spouses and children in less than a year or year and a half. We also protected the brain atrophy, in particular in the part of the brain that's responsible for cognition, which is called hippocampus, and the biomarker that literally can show the brain destruction have also been dramatically lowered, much more than all the others, and it's a safe product. So now we'll get a little bit to the market opportunity, to the commercial value. So the main need right now is for a treatment that not only can treat the patients that have the highest risk, because the patients with the ApoE4 gene get the disease more than a decade earlier, so not in the 70s or 80s. By the way, in the 80s, third of the population will have Alzheimer's disease. Think about it. So, you know, everybody who gets it in the 80s will started the process in the 60s. So that's the reason why it's such a devastating disease and cause called one of the, you know, along with the global warming, the biggest threat to humanity as the population is aging. But again, for our treatment, really what it allows potentially is to treat patients with the highest risk, the young and healthy people, literally, and then also can efficiently treat the patients before they develop the clinical symptoms, what's called pre-symptomatic. So from the antibodies that have been gone through the regulatory review, the FDA issued what's called black box warning for those antibodies, because the rate of the side effects, the brain pneumatic hemorrhage in these patients with the ApoE4 gene is so profound that they ask physicians to avoid actually treating those patients, which again is the first pass for us, our first indication that we want to pursue with the regulator. So this talks about the costs. So the cost for the antibodies, the ones that have been already approved, the aducanumab started at over $56,000 just for the drug per year. Then they dropped the price to about a half. The lecanemab had also been approved. It's now at about kind of mid 20,000, so $23,000 per year. But the cost for treating these patients, you know, the infrastructure cost is actually several-fold higher. So the true impact of annual cost for these treatments is really over $100,000. It's estimated about $120,000 per year. And if you think about the millions of patients that need it in the U.S., there are 6 million patients with the clinical, the terminal Alzheimer's disease, and over 50 million people with you know, the biologically defined, that means the preclinical and the clinical. It's just staggering, right? I mean, no society can actually afford to use this treatment. It's very complex. You see the what we call the patient journey is that the patients will have to go and interact with the insurers or the physicians, you know, 20 to 30 times, which is the claim. This is the summary of patient journey. It takes a very long time for them to get the treatment. And again, it's very expensive and cumbersome. We save, you know, enormous costs by just having a pill and very easy access to the drug. And that's really essentially, again, our advantage over those treatments. There's, again, the population is staggering. Even of those patients in the terminal stage of the disease runs into millions of patients, as you can see here, both in the US and then in the European markets. So I'm going to wrap up this last few slides on kind of where we're heading and what are the opportunities once you solve the scientific puzzle. So in our pipeline, we talk mostly about the Alzheimer's treatments that are targeting this toxin called amyloid. And as you can see, there are a number of indications in Alzheimer's disease, some others, including actually the major cause of blindness, which is called dry age-related macular degeneration, is likely caused by the similar toxin. So that's our other program. But really, the solution of being able to treat Alzheimer's disease with a small molecule applies to other neurodegenerative disorders, because all of the neurodegenerative disorders are really caused by normal proteins that have an important function in the brain, but that they change the shape and start being toxic to specific neuronal population and cause the different disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so forth. And we have close to 5,000 compounds that actually can be applied to those other disorders. We work also on the diagnostics. As you can imagine, it's important to find these patients early. So we are able to and we're starting to develop a diagnostic test, that would allow us to do it. In fact, we work with a very prominent Czech institute called IOCB. This slide really summarizes the insights into brain neurodegeneration. And it's really that, again, you have a normal important proteins in the brain that when they get trapped in the brain because they cannot be cleared out, they change the shape and they start aggregate, spread through the brain, like prions, which is the way they actually accumulate and snowball in the brain and cause disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS, and so forth. So again, coming back to the business, so where the orange arrow is, we're expecting our final data from the final phase 3 in the late summer of next year. We'll plan to submit the application to the U.S. regulators later next year, and then planning for a launch in the U.S. In 2025. We need to make 70 tons of the drug. So we're very busy with building the group or the company we work with on the manufacturing has to build a separate plant just for our drug. And then the year later, we'll plan to do European launch. So in summary, our approach, it took over a decade now, but we have we really were able to solve the scientific puzzle of Alzheimer's, but now we also have a treatment that potentially could be incredibly important for these millions and tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people, especially because it can intervene before the symptoms start, and it will prevent the brains of those patients from being destroyed by the disease, which otherwise it's really inevitable. I mean, the main driver of the disease is aging. So everybody who gets really old will be at risk, and that's our opportunity. And I'll stop here and happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you so much. That's actually incredibly interesting. And, I think it's really important to highlight to everybody just how fast that development has been. You said it's 10 years, but that's quite fast compared to a lot of drugs. And so that's fantastic.
And you're right, Julia, that the average time from really the start of the program to treatment is 14 years average, yep. Right? So it usually, these programs really take decades.
That's right. And I just wanted to step back a little bit to review the context a bit. So we know that developing a treatment for Alzheimer's it involves tons of research, years of research, and enormous development costs. How does your company approach financing and resource allocation to support your innovation, and especially in the face of the high failure rates that's common in drug development?
Yep. So it's interesting, right? Because everybody who kind of, follows the field, and it's like, why did, not Pfizer or Roche or some of the big pharma companies kind of solve this problem and dealt it? And, this is for those who don't work in smaller companies or biotech. The advantage of working in the smaller companies, less bureaucracy, obviously, less overhead. We really can focus on this one problem. And again, you have to believe and you have to follow the science. But, the costs are dramatically lower. Obviously, we still had to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. We're still a private company, but we're raising now. Our last round has been over $1 billion, so at $1 billion pre-money. So it is involves still a number of substantial costs. But again, especially the innovation. It's surprising, but the innovation is really driven through the biotechnology world, less so from the big pharmas. I worked at Pfizer for a few years. That was my kind of training grounds. And you can see why, right? The big pharmas are really their expertise is in commercializing. They are able to deliver the drug anywhere on the planet and kind of go through all the regulatory loops and what have you. But really, the true innovation often does happen in the biotechnology. And again, it allows a group of people to be really focused on one problem and solve it. And if you're successful, you have access to financing, obviously, because the opportunity is so large.
Fantastic. And another question just following onto that is, how did data help you narrow into your solution? This is particularly interesting for all of us from an economic point of view, but the impact in the data, the crunching numbers.
Yeah. So again, this is one of the many companies I've either led or founded, and we follow the science, for lack of a better word, right? I mean, we do have. Again, our solution has been to focus what's called the precision medicine, focus on the highest risk patients, and allowed us to uncover the underlying biology. But again, I mean, one of our companies had a phenomenal technology, Nobel laureate, founder, and so forth, but it didn't translate from animals into humans, and we shut off the light and walked away, right? So the failure rate is still fairly high, but you are nimble and you can adapt to it. And if it's the wrong approach, you change the tune and do it again elsewhere, or start another company. So again, you let the obviously what's the life in the biotech company is that you live and die by your data and everything, right? So it makes it very acute and kind of very intense environment. But again, that's also why it works so well.
Excellent.
Okay. And can I ask, this is actually a question from the Q&A session. How did you manage to get to the phase 3 without partnering with giants? So obviously, it's very costly.
Very. So again, it was very difficult to finance this kind of effort during the days where everybody thought it's impossible, right? Nobody understood the science. People were, literally telling us, do you want to destroy me? The usual investors, the usual Wall Street, right? But then once we published a number of papers that uncovered the science, and we're starting to get support, from investors. And now it's really it's 180 degrees, because now the enormous opportunity and the commercial value of it has been clear. So now, it's much easier. We are also, again, able to secure financing from the National Institute on Aging. So you can imagine that, for the U.S. Economy and U.S. It's enormous costs, that runs now to have about $500 billion a year, taking care of the patients with Alzheimer's. So there has been substantial focus, to support the innovative therapy. So that was the other kind of part of the support for our work. But again, it's very difficult to go against the grain, and Alzheimer's was considered insolvable. So it was not impossible to finance. Again, think about it. If the big pharmas, can spend, billions and tens of billions, say, well, this is too difficult, and run away, why would the usual investor groups, the venture capital, private equity, what have you, invest, right? It's been literally impossible.
Great. Ava, do you have another question?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask, regarding what you said before, that you are focusing on the American market. You also, in the presentation, you have written, basically it was 1/5 of the confirmed cases was from US. So it makes sense, obviously. But isn't that the question of diagnosing? So that's why I went into diagnosing as well. That's in the rest of the world probably doesn't have a lower prevalence. It's just
yeah, I mean it's really age-driven disease. So the highest prevalence of Alzheimer's in the oldest economies, right? Japan, South Korea, and China. In fact, they have kind of the most aging population. So, and again, I mean, you have to realize all these breakthroughs are just literally, happened over the past year or a couple of years. in our ability to diagnose and so forth. So the U.S. market has been very important for us because there has been a lot of scientific support. Now, obviously, we have a strong support from Wall Street and so forth. So for us, it's the place where we really want to look for the first approval, but we want to make drug available to all the patients across the planet. So we're obviously running the phase 3 study both in the US and Europe. So we want to introduce the drug there. We would look for partners in Japan. It's a very distinct market. And we have a lot of interest from Japanese companies. And then the rest of the world will follow. Again, for those who worked in the US, they realize why a lot of the things that can happen only in the US, for a lot of the reasons. I work in Boston, Alzheon is in Boston. The combination of the universities, the expertise in biotechnology, the venture capital, the proximity of the Wall Street has been absolutely essential, right? You have to have this ecosystem that really allows you to, find ideas, organize the team that can do this work, but also finance the efforts.
Excellent. And now we have a question from Jan Schwenar. Jan?
Great seeing you. And over the years that we've been talking, etc., the progress is just incredible. So congratulations, first of all. And let me just ask you a question. So now that you've kind of surmounted all these issues and problems, as you're heading into the finish line, so to speak, what do you see could be the greatest danger to actually completing it, if there is, such a thing? What is sort of making you think we better watch out?
Now, it's really what I would call the execution risk, right? So we have a drug that, for the past decade, every time we tested it, worked, right? Including the most recent data from 2-year follow-up in our studies. There is but what the regulators require, and appropriately, they require a positive phase 3 study, right? They require that you run an experiment in large population, a large number of patients that is positive and really defines the safety, efficacy, and so forth. So for us, we ran our phase 3 study in over 100 top clinical sites, clinical institutions on the planet, across, again, US, Canada, and Europe. It's in the middle of pandemic, so there's always some risk, that something, just will not go exactly right. So honestly, that's our biggest risk. We know there's enormous need for this kind of product. We have a lot of data that assure us of the safety of this approach. The regulators, again, specifically are warning against using the only available treatment, which is the antibody treatments, because of the safety issues in the population we're pursuing. And the payers, who will carry the cost, they are frightened, literally, starting with Medicare, who covers most of these patients, but also the private payers with, their potential, need to cover actually these kind of costs. So, we have an incredible opportunity, but we need to have a positive readout, which really is an experiment, right? Again, as much as we believe, we have 90+% chance of success, there's still a risk of running this kind of experiment, globally in the setting of pandemic and what have you, right? So that's really the risk. What it would mean that we would have to run this kind of experiment again. Again, going to be difficult to get approval, without the positive phase 3. We can potentially get a conditional approval. There are a lot of ways, other ways actually, or what's called the accelerated approval, that the regulators can allow this drug on the market, especially because it's the safety is so obvious, right? Most what the regulators are most afraid of is that the drug is going to be dangerous to patients. So that's not that we have addressed already. But again, we're fingers crossed, in less than a year, we'll know how the phase 3 turns out. That's the biggest risk.
Well, good luck. Good luck.
Thank you.
So there's two questions in the chat regarding Leqembi. So how does your pill compare to it? And what are the effects of Leqembi's FDA approval or in Alzheon's process, its research investment, and the likelihood of FDA approval?
Very good question. So Leqembi is the best of the antibodies. In fact, we worked closely with the group at a company called BioArctic, which is again a biotechnology company in Sweden that developed this drug, and we know the scientific founders, and in fact, they follow the science, we have been developing closely, but it's an antibody. It has shown the best efficacy and least of the side effects, but still, right? It really showed that the patients that had a high risk with the APOE4 gene have really unacceptable level of brain edema and hemorrhage. This is why the FDA issued a black box warning for this drug, right? Think about it, this is the safest of the three antibodies that are heading for the market. So for us, it really the value was that it showed without any doubt that the approach that we have been developing is valid. It can help patients, number one. Number two, there's a clear need for a better treatment, in particular, safer treatment, and it really opens the door, for everybody else, to follow. And again, in many ways, if it's the right way to say it kind of decreased the regulatory hurdle for us because it showed, again, that this approach works, which FDA always looks at other programs in the class. And the second is that there's a clearly need for a drug that will not cause the brain edema and hemorrhage in these highest risk patients. So, it's been helpful on the scientific, on the commercial basis, for us. And it really, kudos to, again, it was another biotechnology company that spent several decades, in fact, to developing this treatment before it got to where it is. And it's awesome to have, this kind of support, because for the longest time, we were the only ones, kind of pursuing this approach.
That's quite interesting. And, just wondering about, we talked about the US and the FDA, but what are the differences between introducing a drug in the United States and in European countries? And does it pay off to enter the European market? I mean, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, so first of all, there's a substantial degree of what's called harmonization between the military agencies, especially US and EU. So you can use the similar packages, for registration. The process is different in many ways because you usually don't go to a single agency, which is called European Medicines Agency, EMA, but you go to specific countries. So you start the process in specific countries where you get the scientific advice and then kind of follow with the registration. The main difference probably between the two regions is the pricing. There's a very different focus and very, much more kind of in the US, you have to realize that the regulators, they don't discuss the price at all. They don't actually touch on the price. Their job is to say, do we know enough about safety and efficacy of the treatment to, and then they ask, their advisory committees, do you believe that this is something that should be approved, right? And then they still make it their own decision. In Europe, there's a tremendous focus on the costs and the cost benefit. So, there are very formal kind of government reviews in each of the countries. Does this drug at the price that would be introduced really is worth it really to be introduced? So there are treatments that are approved in the US that are not approved in Europe and so forth. So it's a little bit different approach. That said, right? Again, the cost for Alzheimer's disease at present are over $1 trillion. If you can think that the US spends $500 billion, European countries spend probably the same. The population is similar, just a bit larger. So again, I mean, there's enormous need for effective treatment, and but the process, to introduce these kind of treatments is a little bit different and a little bit more lengthy, again, because of the negotiations with the with the countries on the price. Now, in the US, you're negotiating with the payers, right? So we're already talking to the insurance agencies. And in fact, there was enthusiastic support because they see the value of the enormous savings that you can potentially bring from having an oral treatment that doesn't require, the huge infrastructure costs on infusion centers and what have you, but also the follow-up for the safety of the brain event hemorrhage. So, they are really hoping that we will be able to introduce the drug and save the enormous costs.
Great. And just to clarify for everyone, so because this is a small molecule drug, it's a pill form, which is what makes it so much cheaper to provide to people rather than the infusions, which other drugs are provided through. So it makes a big cost savings. And I'm wondering also regarding age, is there when the FDA or other regulatory agencies are looking at pricing, are they thinking about the age of patients, and or are they just looking at the general cost to society when they're making their decisions on?
Need to make pharmacoeconomic analysis. In fact, we're working closely with experts at the University of Southern California has a large center actually working on this. So we're working with academics and so forth, because you really need to make an argument. If you pay, for this kind of treatment, and Julia, you were very right that it's like, at what age do you start treating patients? It's becoming very clear that if you can avoid the institutionalization, right? The problem is that once you get the terminal stage, the clinical stage, in a few years, the family wouldn't be able to take care of you. And the costs for taking care of the patients in the institutions are just staggering. I mean, this is where, again, it costs you tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to take care of the patients who really cannot, but the family cannot take care of them anymore. And this is the highest cost to the society. So if you can prevent, again, that's why our goal is, as I show in one of the graphs, is to treat the patients well before they have the clinical symptoms, and the brain damage is at the stage where, you really have the symptoms. Because again, you cannot regrow the brain. You're not going to recover the function and the cognitive abilities. Once you lose it, it's gone. So the only way to deal with it is the prevention. And again, there's a very strong pharmacoeconomic argument for intervening at the time where you can say, because we have a biomarker that can really tell you that the brain is degenerating, right? I didn't get much into the science, but we can find patients who look absolutely normal, but we can say your brain cells are dying. We can do it actually from plasma tests and so forth. So once you have that, because you will need to have it still for being able for the physicians to prescribe the treatment, right? But then, again, I think you have a strong argument that if you can prevent the institutionalization, which for some patients, right? Ronald Reagan, the American president, Margaret Thatcher spent literally a decade, or over a decade actually, institutionalized, because they were very healthy except for the brain. And the costs are just enormous. So there's a strong, again, pharmacoeconomic benefit, which we need to provide anyway, right? Which we will actually do, and we're starting to present at the conferences or our collaborators actually start to present.
Fantastic. Ava, do you want to go with the next question?
Yeah, so the next question from the public is actually connected to this like financing or making the production possibilities for a wider spread. So do you see the need for software platforms to support and streamline drug manufacturing, distribution, or the financing side of the manufacturing?
Again, the way we work as a biotech company, we really work with the top, organizations in, that run the clinical trials, that manufacture the drug, that, kind of work through all these things. So, they do have, obviously all the tools that you can imagine, to do that. But again, we don't carry, we oversee all this work and we hire them to do that work, but we don't really need to implement it ourselves. Our skill set is to, again, uncover the science, develop the treatment, and go through the regulatory approvals, at least in the major markets, and then introduce the drug to the patients You know, the technology and the information technology obviously has been important in every stage of the drug discovery, drug development, and commercialization. But it's really not something that we need to build or manage ourselves.
Interesting. And you know, I know that the EU is considering some clinical trial, a giant clinical trial platform. Is this something that you think is going to speed up drug development? What's your thought on that?
You know, there are a lot of ways to model the clinical trials, but the gold standard always is, you know, define the population, you know, treat half patients with the active drug, half with the placebo in double-blind fashion. That means neither the patients nor the physicians, neither us actually, know who's treated with what. And then this is the golden standard. And I think it's going to be very difficult to go, you know, kind of get away. You know, I've been approached by serving on the board of a number of companies that do what's called the digital twins, you know, that run the kind of the digital trials and so forth. But again, I'm hard pressed to believe that, you know, they would be able to supplant. They can enhance, I guess, the trials in real patients, but I don't think they can supplant it in any meaningful way anytime soon. And again, you know, this is the reason why the trials are so costly, because the phase 3 trials cost a lot of billions of dollars and take, you know, many years to complete. And you really have to commit the funds, you know, commit the resources. And you have no idea, right, what's going to be at the end. I mean, you obviously have a lot of data to support that approach, but again, you know, the string of failures that again cost, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars show that how risky this is and how you know, how unlikely it is that you ever be in a situation of where you're actually completing the phase 3, even getting to the stage, right? It's like a 1 in a million chance.
Absolutely true. And so go ahead, Eva, with our next question.
So the next question was actually related to the clinical trials. And the question was, where did you see the highest friction or miscommunication between parties involved in the distribution of your drug doses for clinical trials? Whether you see it and where do you see it?
So, you know, again, we have a very seamless process running the clinical study. We selected what's called a clinical research organization, a partner that has a global presence and so forth. So we, you know, for us, the biggest disruption, quite frankly, has been the COVID, you know, was the both, you know, recruitment, you know, follow-up of the patients. Think about it, right? The whole world shut down. And we were running the clinical study in the midst of that. So, you know, getting the drug to the right side, getting it to the patients, following the patients and so forth has really been the biggest challenge for us. Otherwise, you know, it's been, you know, we have been able to select the top sites, clinical institutions on the planet. They obviously were very interested in working with us. We have enthusiastic support from them, from the patients and so forth, and the patient families. But you cannot plan for, you know, COVID pandemic, right? So in the midst of all of this.
And what would you, you know, just to start wrapping up the questions right now, I think, what would be your recommendation for students who are interested in working in health economics and innovation economics as they are, you know, looking at you as an inspiration and model moving forward?
You know, so again, my career started in Czech, where I grew up in Prague, you know, did actually computer science and medicine. Had an opportunity to work, go to US for graduate school. Was in a group of one of the Nobel laureates, Kandel, at Columbia. Then trained in Boston, went to Yale, was there on faculty. And then really, you know, once kind of thing led to another, started to work at Pfizer. They sent me to business school. So I did actually 4 universities along the way. And you know, you really, if you want to work in this space, right, the more you learn, the better off you are. And you have no idea what's possible until you actually kind of go through these different steps. So people always ask, well, did you have a plan? I had no idea, right? I mean, again, you cannot plan for this kind of career, right? But again, one step's kind of less to the other, opens your eyes, you know, brings other people and the inspiration for other things. So that's what led to both, founding Alzheon, but also a number of other companies, both in the biotech and the IT spaces, founding of the institute to study, how our brains work, both healthy and diseased and so forth, right? So again, I think, the kind of the only kind of, if I look back, right, for me, the real advantage has been the opportunity to learn, right, to study. I was really excited about it. I spent 30 years in school and training, so it was easy after that.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. First of all, we're so grateful that you're joining us today, and we're also really grateful that you're a member of our foundation board. It's been wonderful to speak today. I also want to thank everyone who joined us and all around the world. And before we sign off, I just want to let everyone know that the foundation, we are inviting a variety of speakers to our distance learning program speaker series. And stay tuned for our next call early in 2024.